So there's obviously it's a massive subject, and there's a lot that could be said about the otherness or othering of Jews in Christian Europe in the early modern period. The title, just to remind you, is The Other Within in Christian Europe in the Early Modern Period. So in this kind of talk, I shall concentrate on what were perceived as physical and somatic differences between Christian Europeans in the early modern period and Jews. Obviously, perceived physical differences between peoples have been used as a vague badge of innate moral and mental difference since ancient times. But systemic anthropological and biological theories about the physical differences between peoples and their origin, conceived in the West in relatively recent times, were largely responsible for what we now know as racism. These new theories emerged at a time when increasingly people were doubting the biblical explanation of the origin of the different human types to be found in the world. And with the great European voyages of the 15th and 16th century, new sorts of people were being discovered at an unprecedented rate, and the scientists and scholars of the time labored over taxonomies which took all this new diversity into account. The discovery of these previously unknown populations in Africa and the New World in the 15th century acted as a catalyst for the enlightenment of pre-Adamism, an old theological argument which posited the existence of races of man before the creation of Adam. So that's one. And polygenesis, which is the theory of multiple creations on the other side. So in 1520, the Swiss scholar and physician Paracelsus speculated that the populations which descended from Adam were to be found in a very restricted part of the earth, but that because God didn't like the idea of leaving the rest of the world completely empty, in his wonderful wisdom, he created the Negroes and other people to fill it up. Giordano Bruno, the Dominican friar, philosopher and astrologer, said in 1591 that no sensible person could ever imagine that the Jews and the blacks could possibly have the same ancestry, and that therefore there must have been more than one creation. 30 years later, Lucilio Vanini argued that Africans, but not other people of the world, must have descended from apes, because apes and Negroes are the same color. He was sure that blacks had once walked on all fours. Both Bruno and Vanini were burnt at the stake, Bruno in Rome, Vanini in Toulouse, for their various anti-Catholic heresies. Nonetheless, despite the strictures of the church, and by the end of the 17th century, there were growing and widespread doubts about Judeo-Christian teaching and the biblical creation account, even if those doubts were often and understandably not fully articulated. One of the most important modern contributors to this long-running debate was the radical French theologian, who may have been of Jewish ancestry, Isaac de la Peyrère. At the time, with the memory of what happened to Giordano Bruno still fairly fresh, few people were willing to publicly countenance the idea of polygenesis. But that's exactly what he did with the 1655 publication of Praedamitae. La Peyrère believed in the creation of Adam as described in Genesis, but his interpretation of the story was that Adam was the progenitor, not of the human race, but only of the Jewish nation. In the first chapter of Genesis, as he pointed out, we're told that a man and a woman were created who would have dominion over every living thing. And it's not until the second chapter that we hear anything about Adam and Eve. La Peyrère argued that the first of these creations accounted for the presence of Gentiles in the world. This theory was helpful in explaining some inconsistencies in the Bible account, not least the identity of Cain's wife. Of course, this theory got La Peyrère into trouble, but eventually, under papal pressure, he more or less recanted. However, from the end of the 17th century, the biblical account of the creation of man was to be increasingly questioned, increasingly revised, and gradually ignored. Sir Matthew Hale, the English Puritan jurist, observed, though the creation of man be generally acknowledged by Jews and Christians, yet we must likewise consider that many take it up only as a part of their education and not upon any serious, deep conviction of the truth of it. The traditional view implied that all human types were more or less similar and equal, all having a common father in the biblical Adam, but monogenism was undermined by the vast number of people throughout the newly discovered parts of the globe who appeared to be different and, in addition, were not mentioned in the scriptures. The radical idea of La Pereire, suggesting a different origin for the Jews, coincided with several theories suggesting a separate racial origin for blacks. In the ongoing struggle between monogenists and polygenists, polygenetic anthropology seemed to provide evidence for the essential difference both of Jews and blacks, and subsequently also for the permanent difference and inferiority of Native Americans, Aboriginal Australians, and various other peoples of the world, and served as a justification for their enslavement and persecution. The first systematic attempt to divide humanity into distinct races is very recent. It was made by the physician and traveller François Bernier, who in 1684 wrote the influential Nouvelle division de la Terre par les différentes espèces ou races qui l'habitent, which split humankind essentially into four races. His division was based largely on colour and look. This kind of division, which soon became predominant, complementing earlier political, religious, or geographical divisions, soon involved the colour of Jews, because a long European discourse had argued that the Jews were black or dusky. In any event, they were certainly not white, and since medieval times, they'd been seen as physically different in this very important respect. The preoccupation with the colour of the skin of Jews fed into a particular emphasis on Jews' overall racial makeup as the most obvious, not entirely white other in the European sphere. What was there about the racial origin of Jews which made them so uniquely different and so much discussed? How did Jews fit into the biological map of mankind, and how were they to fit into Western white Christian societies? These very specific questions about Jews soon became central to the Western academic study of race and racial categories, and vastly disproportionate attention was paid to Jews compared with any other human group. Many ideas about Jews which emerged during the race debates of the 18th and 19th century had been foreshadowed and predetermined by medieval prejudice. The new ideas in many cases were little more than a restructuring of medieval superstition dressed up as science. From the period of the Renaissance to the first half of the 20th century, the words gradually changed, but the sentiments and often the metaphors stayed the same. For centuries, a sense had prevailed that Jews were radically different, that they were outside the usual framework of normative humanity. They were excluded from white Christian European normalcy. A part of their supposed difference then, we've seen, was the conviction that they were of a darker colour than Christian Europeans, perhaps black, perhaps brown, and they had sort of Negroid traits. These suspicions coexisted with diametrically opposed fears, namely that the colour and look of Jews were indistinguishable from the colour and look of Christians. Thus, the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, going back a century or so, called by Innocent III, complained that Jews cannot be distinguished by any difference and called for some way of identifying them. In 1218, the Jewish badge was introduced in England. Subsequently, signifiers such as the Jewish hat and badges of different colors, sizes, and shapes were introduced all over Europe. It's worth noting, as an aside, that the Nazis went through a similar process, first arguing that Jews were readily distinguishable and radically physically different in appearance, and then mandating a yellow star to make them readily distinguishable. As early as the 12th century, not only theology, but medicine and natural science conspired to treat the Jews' black or dark complexion not only as an image of the soul, but also as an empirical fact supported by scientific explanations of the day, such as the humoral theory, which argued that the body was made up of 4 humors or liquids, one of which, black bile, was known as melancholy. Melancholy was anomalous in its common association with disease, both mental and physical, and malevolence. Its identification as the black bile also carried sinister associations with night and evil. Lindsay Kaplan has written extensively on this subject. She further explained that the Jews' dark, melancholy complexion was the result of a malign influence as well as punishment for their alleged murder of the Son of God. So they were black because they had crucified Jesus, according to the thought of the day. Consequently, the blood of Jews was black and putrid, and they were associated with blackness in a variety of other ways. So Jews' black, melancholy nature was expressed through their association also with Saturn. As medieval astrology shows, Saturn, allegedly the planet of the Jews, exerted its special influence over Jews as well as over anything black. Al-Kabisi, the Arab astrologer from Aleppo, who became, through Latin translations, a standard authority on astrology in medieval Europe, argued that Saturn had the faith of Judaism, black clothing. To him belongs everything whatsoever that is black. So Saturn has the faith of Judaism, black clothing, whatever is black. It's been shown that the depiction of black or dark Jews in English and European prayer books and psalters from the 12th to the 14th centuries, as well as other factors, suggests that in England there existed an immutable Jewish racial identity corresponding to a more modern way of presenting the idea of race. The Jews were widely considered to be black, yet in the early modern period, there was no reason to suppose that European Jews were darker than European Christians. The cognitive double vision, which performed the act of othering by a transformation from white into black, would be an important factor in the perception of Jews as others for centuries to come, and would achieve its malign flowering during the period of the Third Reich. The definition of Jewish color presented a major problem for the jurists of the Third Reich, and still today, whether or not Jews participate in white privilege has once again become a major issue, which is to say that the color of Jews has once again in current culture wars has become an issue. In the early modern period, there was also a linked idea of permanent and hereditary Jewish physical inferiority. Non-Christians, such as Jews and Moors, were regularly portrayed as pallid, blue, or black, and these colors similarly portrayed death, illness, and, as we've seen, melancholy. The color problematic in English, as well as European constructions of Jewish identity in the medieval and early modern periods, was to some extent a function of the convergence and conflation of ideas about Jews and Moors, while ideas about Moors were similarly conflated with ideas about Black Africans who came to be known as blackamoors, whether they were Muslim or not. Among the blackamoors, or perhaps beyond the blackamoors, on the furthest horizons of the European imagination, there were supposed to be vast numbers of Jews who potentially represented a mortal threat to Christendom. These Jews, of course, were black, and this fact was another feature of the othering of Jews in the early modern period. The well-known legends which flowed from Eldad Hadani, Eldad the Danite, referred to by Adolf Neubauer as the Arabian Night of the Jews, suggested that there were substantial, well-organized Jewish populations in Africa. In 1523, a pamphlet printed in Augsburg warned that there were 600,000 Schwarz- und Rotjuden, black and red Jews, who were poised to capture Jerusalem from the Moors. And German-speaking areas of Europe, the Rote Juden, the red Jews, representing the 10 lost tribes of Israel, were imagined to be allies of the Antichrist and were expected to invade Europe and destroy Christianity at the end of days. Germans were terrified by these horrific, pestilential people of color who were set to destroy them. Another means of othering the Jews of Europe came through the notion of their innate ugliness, which would be much developed from the 19th century on and into the Nazi period. In the 16th century, Sebastian Münster recorded a fascinating and graphic dialogue between a Christian and a Jew, which was written both in Latin and Hebrew, so that both Christians and Jews could read it. So this dialogue starts with the Christian speaking to the Jew in Hebrew. Taken back, the Jew asks the Christian, how did he know that the Jew, was familiar with Hebrew and that he was a Jew? And the Christian replies, in the language of the 1655 English translation, you Jews have a peculiar color of face, different from the form and figure of other men, which thing hath often filled me with astonishment, for you're black and uncomely. You're not beautiful and not white as other men. It's an intriguing dialogue. The developments in the early modern othering of Jews had recourse to a vision of white, Caucasian, and classical beauty, as opposed to dark and or Semitic ugliness. This, of course, was standard practice. As the great historian of the Holocaust, George Moss, put it, most races consequently endowed inferior races, whether black or Jew, with several identical properties, such as lack of beauty. And it was only in very recent times that blacks became beautiful, and Jews too, with the appearance, allegedly, of Paul Newman and Elizabeth Taylor. One of the arguments deployed to try to explain the physical difference and ugliness of Jews was the food they ate. In 1599, Henry Butts, one-time master of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, produced an entertaining food guide called Diet Dry Dinner. He noted correctly that the Jews were great lovers of goose, which creature, according to him, filled the body with superfluous humours. This resulted in the Jews being passing melancholious, their colour swart, black, and their diseases very perilous. If they'd eaten hare instead, he opined, they might possibly have become paler and more beautiful. Indeed, as he went on to point out, the Italians had a saying which speaketh thus of a fair man, look how handsome he is. He's eaten a hare. Religious belief or faith in general was thought to manifest itself physically in such a way that one's inner religious convictions were visible externally. Judaism, like other religions, was thought to manifest itself somatically. This phenomenon, by the way, is a far better way of understanding the limpieza di sangue opposition in the early modern period in Spain, rather than as a development of racial theory avant la lettre. In other words, the Jewish blood, both of practicing Jews and of conversos, was considered to contain traces of the Judaic faith, and some recent scholarship has confirmed this perspective. In some cases, faith trumped biology, absolutely. The English play, A Christian Turned Turk, 1612, by the dramatist Robert Dayborn, includes a dialogue in which one character asks another, "Doth religion move anything in the shapes of men?" And the other replies, "Altogether. What's the reason otherwise that the Turk and the Jew is troubled, for the most part, with gouty legs and fiery nose? It's to express their heartburning. Whereas the Puritan is a man of upright calf and clean nostril." Religious belief also governed color. Mutability or immutability of color, which would become a major theme of 19th and 20th century racial theorists, was framed in the 17th century in terms of conviction. Blacks exposed to Christianity were capable, it was said, there were a couple of cases in Venice, of turning white. Similarly, in 1648, Thomas Calvert, a vicar of Trinity College, York, Trinity Church, York, published a translation of the testimony to the truth of the Christian faith of one Rabbi Samuel, a converted Jew from Fez. This anti-Jewish diatribe, which was first published in 1339, was called in Calvert's much later translation, "The Blessed Jew of Morocco," or "A Blackamoor Made White." It explained that through conversion to Christianity, a Jew's naturally black color could be transformed into white. Isaac Laperere, I mentioned earlier, also noted that a Jew's black color would turn as white as a dove's breast once he was baptized. Conversion affected Jews in other ways too, one of which was odor, one of the most powerful triggers of contempt and a classic way of othering. Jews were thought to give off a particularly unpleasant odor, known as the fetor judaicus in medieval and early modern Europe. However, this smell would disappear once a Jew converted to Christianity. Caesarius of Heisterbach, the best-selling author of Miracle Tales, wrote of a Jewish girl converted to Christianity who, fragrant herself, was able to pick up the unpleasant scent of her unconverted Jewish father from a very great distance. However, in his famous Pseudodoxia Epidemica, or Vulgar Errors, the great Sir Thomas Browne dismissed this superstition impatiently while recognizing that it was all too prevalent. He wrote, in The Conceit of the Evil Odor of the Jews, Christians, without any further research into the verity of the thing or inquiry into the cause, draw up a judgment upon them from the passion of their Saviour. According to this superstition, Jews could immediately be identified by their odor, which was reminiscent of the smell of the male goat, known in medieval Europe as the Jew's beast. As soon as they were baptized, however, as a French writer, Misson, put it, their noisome smell vanished. Again, it's worth noting that the canard of the Jews' odor persisted through anti-Semitic writing of the 19th century. I think of Dr. Celticus at the beginning of the 20th century in France, and also during the period of the Third Reich, quite famously, the Nazi race theorist Hans Günther was convinced that eventually the telltale odor of Jews would be scientifically identified through chemical analysis and would then provide what the Nazis never had, and of course could never have, namely a reliable way of immediately identifying Jews. From the beginning of the 13th century, Christian images of Jews were often aggressive and hostile, included demonic features, bristling beards, brutish expressions, and large or hooked noses. Routinely represented in every kind of visual representation, from stained glass windows to manuscript illumination, Jews often appeared as freaks, demons, hybrids, or monsters, often reminiscent of the monstrous races of classical literature. The intrepid Italian aristocrat Ludovico di Vattema, author of Itinerario di Ludovico di Vattema, Bolognese, which was published in Rome in 1510, noted for being perhaps the first non-Muslim European to visit Mecca, intriguingly described encountering some pygmy Jews. Pygmies, of course, are one of the monstrous races of classical literature, on a mountain near Medina. Now, who knows whether this was true or not, and whether really the mountain was near Medina or further south in highland Yemen. If it was near Medina, of course, it would be particularly interesting, and conceivably these could have been remnants of the Jews who famously lived in the Hejaz in the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Anyway, that aside, in the English translation provided in Purchas His Pilgrims, these pygmy Jews were of very little stature, as of the height of 5 or 6 spans, and some much less. They have small voices like women, and of black colour, yet some blacker than others. Their circumcises denied not themselves to be Jews. They wandered in that mountain, scattered like wild goats or prickets. Not a word I think that any one of you knows. Pricket is sort of early modern English for goat. The same association of Jewish pygmies, goats, and monstrous races appeared in the margins of the 13th century Rutland Psalter, where there's an image of a small male figure, no doubt a pygmy, looking quizzically at a flute playing goat. As other monstrous races from the classical repertoire, quite apart from pygmies, figure in the marginalia of this Psalter, it's reasonable to suppose that the Jews and goat motif are intended to conjure up both an allusion to the monstrous races and to the Jew's beast. Trachtenberg, the great historian of medieval superstitions with respect to the Jews, similarly identified the goat both as a symbol of satanic lechery and as an animal associated with Jews who would often be portrayed riding a goat. A northern French manuscript from the same period shows a Jew, again with an orange cap, shooting an owl, suggesting that the Jews were not just monstrous, but also blind and despised. The owl was a common bestiary figure, often associated with Jews, which was thought to shun the light in the same way that Jews shunned the light of Christ. Another 13th century hybrid from Salisbury in England consisted of a manticore, a creature with a lion's body and the poisonous tail of a scorpion, with a grotesque Jewish profile and a long beard. The monster is gnawing on a human leg, notwithstanding that marginal hybrids were often playful or jocular and intended to entertain. The overwhelming sense of portrayals of Jews throughout this sort of literature is that they were in the same conceptual category as the ethnocentric Greco-Roman monstrous races. In the early modern period, the fear of Jews as dangerous and violent polluters which was common among the lower classes, also spread to learned elites, and particularly to humanist circles. This can be seen in the way Renaissance humanists generally responded so enthusiastically to the blood libel, the medieval accusations, which started in England in the 12th century, that Jews used the blood of Christian children to make Passover matzot or for some other ritual. Such a case in 1475 in Trento in northern Italy ended with all the male Jews of the town being judicially murdered and the women and children forcibly converted to Catholicism. Members of what we might presume was an enlightened group had come to perceive the Jewish presence as a danger. Jews were evil miscreants and polluters of social and religious purity. They were also seen as ever ready to act out their hatreds. Their humanist opponents fundamentally wanted the Jews to go away, sometimes attributing them with magical prowess and the darkest of desires. That which principally animated the humanists, therefore, was the desire to neutralize imagined Jewish aggression. Humanist hatreds of Jews' brutish, untutored violence played into 18th century thinking in several ways. Edward Long, a kind of race theorist of a sort, for instance, maintained that Jews, ancient and modern, were aggressive and engaged in vile practices and rascally tricks. Indeed, throughout the century, a number of negative motifs informed the construction of Jews, including references to the transgressive and transnational wandering Jew motif, which had the effect of putting Jews as nomadic, stateless wanderers outside the normative framework of the national body politic. Because of their perceived refusal to assimilate to European norms, Immanuel Kant considered that the Jews were outside the norms of civilized people, as they were noisome social vampires who were harmful to society. Both Enlightenment theists like Voltaire and atheists like Baron d'Holbach and his followers promoted a monster image of Judaism and portrayed Jews as harmful and subversive anti-citizens in their debates which preceded Jewish emancipation. The Jewish body, like the diseased Jewish mind, was alien and suspect. On occasion, the darkness of the skin of Jews was explained as being not due to inheritance or to religious conviction, as we've seen above, but to the effects of disease such as syphilis, a trope which would persist until modern times. The mark of darkness of the Jew was thus not only a mark of religion or sin or inferiority or shared blood with Africans, but was a pathological taint. The Jewish Enlightenment physician Elkan Isaac Wolff, author of Von den Krankheiten der Juden, Von den Krankheiten der Juden, also saw Jews' yellowish, brownish, tawny skin color as a pathological mark of the sickly Jew, which was ultimately, according to him, due to endemic poverty. And in 1808, the enlightened and Hebrew-speaking, sort of, English physician and ethnographer James Cowles Pritchard from Bristol made the same kind of connection between the national character and psychology of Jews and their color as medieval Christians had made. He stressed that the choleric and melancholic constitution of the Jews was such that they usually have a skin somewhat darker than the English people. The Jews' sickly and melancholic constitution was apparently very different from that of the more robust populations among whom they lived. This led to the widespread belief that the Jewish body, essentially different, was subject to different physical and medieval laws. In 18th century France, by way of example, there were considerable discussions about whether susceptibility to disease was an integral aspect of racial identity in general, and whether one theory of medicine could be applied to all of the inhabitants of any specific country. The most obvious ethnic minority in France at the time, as in other European countries, was the Jews. A report on the diseases of the Jews was compiled by a certain Monsieur Lejeune, a physician from Calais, in around 1783. It seemed evident to Monsieur Lejeune that Jews were prone to certain diseases but immune to others. And this important fact, as well as many other things, seemed to set them absolutely apart from their non-Jewish neighbors. A little later, in 1812, in Rosheim, in northeastern France, there was an outbreak of miliary fever, a type of tuberculosis. It was noted that not one Jew among the 600 to 700 who lived in Rosheim could be counted among the more than 300 people who contracted the fever. How could this be explained? Were there peculiar religious practices at the root of it, or was there something about the Jewish body itself? Whether such Jewish so-called immunities or susceptibilities were innate or due to social or religious causes was a hotly debated issue of the day. Medical issues related to plagues and contagions inevitably return time and time again to issues of human difference or unity. Moreover, discussions about the somatic difference of the Jewish body form part of the larger debate as to whether Jews could ever truly be part of the European body politic. With the growth throughout the 18th century of the doctrine of multiple human origins, which would peak in the mid-19th century, came the conviction that different racial bodies with essentially immutable characteristics were obliged to react to all sorts of stimuli, including epidemics and other diseases, in their own unique and specific way. For the polygynists, race determined everything. For their opponents, the monogenists, environmental and social factors predominated. Great efforts were devoted by both sides to understanding why some races apparently succumbed, while others flourished in the face of the contagious disease. And of course, we saw many examples of this kind of thing during the recent pandemic. For Dr. Jean-Christian Marboudin, the erudite anthropologist and much published chief physician at the military hospital of Le Roule in Paris, the Jews responded to contagious diseases in a categorically different way than white Europeans. The more, he wrote, one studies the Jewish race, the more one perceives it's subjected to pathological laws of demarcation between it and the populations amid which it happens to dwell. The Jews were wonderfully exempt from heavier scourges, he writes, from plagues in 1336, from typhus in 1505 and 1824, from intermittent fevers at Rome in 1691, from dysentery at Nimègue in 1736, and typhus in Langeron in 1824. Fantasies of contagion in which invulnerable Jews became the contagion were used against Jews throughout the 19th century and constitute one of the many paths which led to the Holocaust. From the period of the Enlightenment, the Jewish body was either particularly prone to epidemics, immune to them, or a vector of contagion. The racialized medicine and anthropology of the 19th century, both in Europe and the Americas, often discussed supposed Jewish immunities. In 1874, the Louisiana physician Madison Marsh argued that Jews had a much greater tolerance for a number of contagious diseases than did the general population. There was a general conviction, for instance, that Jews were immune to tuberculosis. This, explained Marsh, was because they had been toughened by centuries of national calamities. And the polemic which ensued, others argued that Jews' apparent racial immunity to this and other diseases was a biological feature of Jews, which was the result not so much of persecution, but of millennia of sanitary habits that had been encoded in Jewish law. Indeed, in 1920, Percival Wood, a military surgeon, penned a book which was entitled Moses, the Founder of Preventive Medicine, in which Moses was described as nothing less than a military surgeon himself, whose public health measures were later incorporated into the permanent settlement of the Israelites. And I see now that my time has elapsed, and I think that might be an appropriate point for me to stop. Thank you very much for listening.